what seemed like a peaceful afternoon in the garden of his luxurious mansion, a millionaire businessman returned home and witnessed a scene that froze his heart. The gardener's daughter discreetly offering a mysterious liquid to his 6-year-old son in a wheelchair. The vial bore a sinister skull symbol, signaling deadly danger. Gripped by absolute panic, he was about to call the police and an ambulance when something impossible happened next. The scent of roses from the mansion's garden was almost suffocating, a sweetness Richard barely noticed. For him, the air always felt heavy, laden with the silent guilt that had accompanied him since the day his son, Leo's, world had shrunk to the dimensions of a wheelchair. That afternoon, the golden late-day sun bathed the perfectly manicured lawn, but its light couldn't penetrate the shadow in his soul. He was a man who had transformed modest initial capital into an empire, a multimillionaire whose fortune in dollars and stock market holdings was a source of admiration and envy. Yet, all his wealth, all his possessions and assets, seemed useless against the stillness of his 6-year-old boy's legs. He had come home early, a rare impulse, driven by a sharp longing that work couldn't assuage. He crossed the marble foyer in silence, ignoring the discreet presence of the staff, and headed for the back patio, from where he could see his most precious possession. Leo was there, near the old oak tree, his small figure framed by the lush green. Beside him, kneeling on the grass, was Lena, the gardener's daughter, a tiny girl with dark braids and lively eyes who seemed too small for the depth of the friendship she shared with Leo. Richard smiled for an instant. It was good to see his son with company, even if the scene was a constant reminder of everything Leo couldn't do. He couldn't run with her, couldn't kick a ball, couldn't climb that tree. Richard's fragile smile vanished the next moment, freezing into a mask of pure horror. His eyes, accustomed to analyzing complex investment charts and identifying profit opportunities, focused on a tiny yet terrifying detail. Lena was holding a small, dark glass vial. With a quick, discreet movement, she offered the vial to Leo, who brought it to his lips. Richard's heart stopped. From that distance, he couldn't read the label, but a universally known symbol was emblazoned in white on the dark glass. A skull and crossbones. Poison. The word exploded in his mind, a silent scream that paralyzed him. The gardener's daughter was giving his son poison, logic dissolved, replaced by a primal panic, the fury of a father protecting his offspring. Why? A cruel prank. Revenge. His mind spun, searching for a reason, any reason. As his legs propelled him forward, he had to stop her, had to save his son. Richard's hand dove into his pocket, searching for his cell phone. 911. He needed to call 911, an ambulance, someone. His trembling fingers could barely swipe the screen. The emergency number was already in his mind when he raised his eyes again, one last time before making the call that would change that family's life forever. And then the impossible happened. In the wheelchair, under the shade of the oak tree, Leo's legs, inert and useless for 2 long and torturous years, twitched. First a spasm, an almost imperceptible tremor. Then a clear, unmistakable movement. The boy's right foot lifted a few inches from the metal rest, floating in the air for a second that seemed an eternity, before falling back down. The phone slipped from Richard's hand, falling silently onto the soft grass. The air left his lungs. The panic that consumed him transformed into a wave of shock, a confusion so profound it left him breathless. The poison, the movement. The two images clashed in his mind, creating a paradox his brain refused to process. Richard's world, built on the certainty of his wealth and the pain of his loss, had just shattered into 1,000 pieces of an impossible possibility. Time seemed to stretch, each second becoming an eternity as Richard walked toward the 2 children. His mind, a mechanism finely tuned to calculate investment risks and manage a vast fortune, was now a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. The panic from a moment ago still echoed in his veins, but it was now overlaid with a layer of perplexity so dense he could barely breathe. The grass beneath his feet felt soft and unreal, as if he were walking in a dream. As he approached, Lena looked up. Her large, dark eyes widened in fear as she saw the expression on her father's employer's face. She recoiled, instinctively pulling the small vial close to her as if to protect it. Leo, in turn, looked at his own leg with a child's astonished expression, touching his knee as if he didn't recognize that part of his body which had just moved of its own accord. Richard stopped before them, his tall shadow covering both. He knelt slowly, an effort that made his knees crack, to get to the children's eye level. His voice came out hoarse, a whisper that barely made it past the lump in his throat. "Lena, what did you give him?" Tears welled up in the girl's eyes, threatening to overflow. She extended a trembling hand, showing the dark glass vial. "It's not poison, Mr. Richard, I swear," she said, her voice thin and choked with restrained sobs. "It's the good medicine, the one that makes Leo move his leg." Richard frowned, his confusion deepening. He took the vial from her hand. The glass was cold to the touch. The skull and crossbones symbol was undeniable, crudely drawn, but clear. "But what about this drawing, Lena? This means danger." The girl's courage seemed to overcome her fear. She sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. Aunt Veronica drew it. She hid this vial deep in the bathroom cabinet and put the medicine that doesn't work in the pretty box. My mom saw her switch them. She said it was so no one would accidentally take it because it was very strong, but it's a lie. This is the medicine that cures. Every word was a blow. Veronica, his wife, the woman he had welcomed into his life, who seemed to dedicate every moment to Leo's well-being. Impossible. Veronica was the personification of kindness and care. She cried with him on difficult nights, celebrated small victories in physical therapy, was his safe harbor in the storm of his grief. Why would she do something so monstrous? Lie, hide a treatment. The idea was so absurd, so vile, that his mind rejected it. It must be a mistake, a child's imagination. But then there was the movement. Leo's undeniable, miraculous leg movement, a fact that couldn't be ignored. He looked from Lena to his son, who now watched him with curiosity, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation. Richard felt the ground give way beneath his feet. If the girl was telling the truth, then the last 2 years of his life, his pain, his son's imprisonment, were not a fatality. They were a farce. A cruel charade orchestrated by the woman who slept beside him. A wave of nausea hit him. All his fortune, all his power, and he had been so blind. He stood up, the vial clutched in his hand so tightly that his knuckles went white. His eyes turned to the imposing mansion. Inside, somewhere, was Veronica, the woman in whom he had placed his blind trust. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. He needed proof. He needed to understand. From that moment on, his house was no longer a home. It was enemy territory, and he needed to navigate it with the caution of one crossing a minefield, for his son's well-being depended on it. Reality snapped back into place around Richard with the brutal force of a broken bone. He looked at Lena's frightened face and the innocent confusion in his son's eyes, and a cold, sharp clarity cut through the fog of his panic. He was a man who built empires, who analyzed the profitability of every investment with surgical precision. He couldn't afford to crumble, not now. With a monumental effort, he softened his expression, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He gently placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. "It's all right, sweetheart. You were very brave for looking after Leo," he said, his voice low and calm, belying the storm raging within him. "This will be our secret for now, okay? Don't tell anyone what happened here. Promise." The girl nodded vigorously, relief relaxing her small shoulders. Richard turned to Leo, his heart clenching at the glimmer of hope on his son's face. It was a fragile flame he needed to protect at all costs. He lifted the boy from the grass and settled him back into his chair, his touch more careful than ever. With the glass vial hidden in his pants pocket, he pushed the wheelchair back toward the house. Each step toward the mansion was like walking into uncharted territory. The walls that once represented security and comfort now seemed complicit in a terrible secret. The house, with all its luxury goods and artworks, suddenly became a gilded cage. As he entered the living room, Veronica rose from the sofa, a book in her lap. Her smile was radiant, her blue eyes sparkling at the sight of him. "Darling, what a nice surprise. You're home early." She approached to kiss him, and Richard had to fight the urge to recoil. Her perfume, which he had always found comforting, now suffocated him. "I missed my champion," he said, the lie escaping with a facility that startled him. He ruffled Leo's hair, avoiding his wife's gaze. "We had a boys' afternoon in the garden." "Oh, how wonderful, but don't let him catch a chill," she said, the concern in her voice sounding perfectly rehearsed. She knelt beside the wheelchair. "How are you feeling, my angel? Did you take your afternoon medicine?" Richard's blood ran cold. He observed the interaction, every word, every gesture, now being filtered through a new and horrific suspicion. The way she touched Leo, the sweetness in her voice. Was it all an act, a performance worthy of a professional? "I'll take him to his room to rest a bit," Richard said, his voice firm. "And then I need to make some calls in the office." He needed space. He needed to think. After leaving Leo in his room with the nanny, Richard locked himself in his study. The silence of the room, with its book-lined walls and the discreet gleam of his business trophies, was a balm. He took the vial from his pocket and placed it on the mahogany desk. The skull and crossbones symbol seemed to mock him. He thought of his net worth, the millions he managed, and realized he had failed in the most important due diligence. Protecting his own family, his blind trust in Veronica had been the worst investment of his life. He needed an ally, someone from outside, someone who wasn't under his wife's spell. A memory surfaced. Dr. Evans, Leo's pediatrician since birth, a kind, white-haired man who had retired shortly before the accident. He was not part of the circle of specialists Veronica had carefully selected. Richard picked up the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found the old number in his contacts and dialed, praying it was still the same. The doctor's voice answered on the second ring, warm and familiar. "Hello? Dr. Evans, this is Richard Fontes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Sorry to call like this. I know you're retired, but I need your help. It's about Leo." "Richard, of course. My boy? What's wrong?" The moment Richard opened his mouth to explain the surreal scene in the garden, he heard a sound that froze him. The soft click of his study doorknob. The door was opening. A chill ran down Richard's spine. Instinctively, he covered the phone's mouthpiece with his hand and turned his chair to face the door, his body tense as a violin string. Veronica entered, a sunny smile on her face that violently contrasted with Richard's inner storm. She carried a silver tray with 2 crystal glasses and a bottle of wine. "I thought we could relax a bit before dinner," she said, her melodic voice filling the tense silence. "You seem so tired today, my love." Richard forced a nod, his heart pounding against his ribs. He gestured to the phone. "Just a minute, darling. Business matters. Stock market. You know how volatile it is." The lie flowed with frightening naturalness. He wondered how long he had been living in a theater. Veronica placed the tray on the coffee table, her presence filling the space, making the study suddenly seem small and claustrophobic. She didn't look directly at his desk, where the small dark vial was partially hidden behind a family photo frame, a family that now seemed like a lie. "Don't be long," she said, casting him an affectionate glance. "I miss you when you bury yourself in work." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Richard waited, counting the seconds until he was sure she was gone. He brought the phone back to his ear, his breathing heavy. "Dr. Evans, are you still there?" "I am, Richard." "Did something happen?" The doctor's worried voice sounded from the other end of the line. Richard stood and went to the door, locking it silently. The feeling of being a prisoner in his own home was suffocating. "Yes, sorry, doctor. I need you to be discreet. I can't say much over the phone, but I need you to examine Leo, and I need you to analyze a substance I found. I suspect he's being wrongly medicated." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Richard could imagine the shock on the old doctor's face. "Richard, that's a very serious accusation. Are you sure?" "I'm not sure of anything," Richard replied, his voice finally breaking, revealing a fraction of his desperation. "That's why I need you. I don't trust the current doctors. Veronica, she chose them. She controls everything." Dr. Evans sighed, a heavy, sad sound. "I understand. Where should I go?" "Not here." "It would be too dangerous," Richard said, looking at the locked door as if he could see through it. He thought quickly, his strategist's mind taking over. "I have a secluded estate in the Catskill Mountains, about an hour from here. It's empty. I can take Leo there tomorrow under the pretense of an outing. Can we meet there?" "Agreed. Send me the address. I'll be there at noon," the doctor said, without hesitation. "And Richard, be careful." Richard hung up, feeling a glimmer of hope, the first in a long time. It was a risky plan. He would need to invent a plausible excuse for Veronica, get Leo out of the house without raising suspicion, and ensure they weren't followed. It was a chess match, and he was playing against an adversary he was only beginning to understand. That night, dinner was an exercise in torture. He sat at the table, eating the meticulously prepared food, listening to Veronica talk about her charity plans, about the euro exchange rate that would affect the trip they were planning. He smiled, agreed, but inside, her every word was like poison. He watched the way she cut Leo's food, how she wiped his mouth with a napkin, an image of maternal devotion. But now, all he saw was the performance, a brilliant actress in her most important role. Later, in his bedroom, as Veronica slept deeply beside him, Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the discovery was overwhelming. It wasn't just about Leo's paralysis, it was about betrayal. The woman with whom he shared his life, his bed, his dreams, might be a stranger, a predator who had infiltrated his life, preying on his vulnerability after the loss of his first wife, Martha. A painful memory hit him. Martha. She had also been ill, a weakness doctors had never been able to fully diagnose, and who was there? Caring for her with tireless dedication, Veronica, the private nurse he had hired. A chilling shiver ran through his body. Could it be? The coincidence was too sinister to be ignored. Suddenly, his son's paralysis was no longer an isolated event. It could be part of a much older, darker pattern, one he had been too blind to see. The next morning dawned grey and damp, mirroring Richard's state of mind. He had barely slept, his mind spinning with dark suspicions, connecting like a spiderweb. The memory of Martha's final illness, his first wife, haunted him with a new and terrible clarity. He recalled her progressive weakness, the confusing diagnoses, and Veronica's constant presence by her side, always solicitous, always with a glass of water or a new medication in hand. At the time, he had seen it as devotion. Now, he saw it as opportunity. During breakfast, he presented his plan with the calculated calm of an executive closing a deal. "I'm thinking of taking Leo to spend the day at the mountain estate," he said casually, spreading jam on toast. "The mountain air will do him good. We can have a picnic." Veronica looked up from her teacup, one eyebrow delicately arched. "Such a sudden idea, darling. Just the two of you." "Yes, a father-son day. I feel like we haven't had much time just for ourselves lately," he replied. Meeting her gaze, his heart beating an anxious rhythm against his chest. He needed her to believe him. Every fiber of his being was on high alert, analyzing her reaction, looking for any sign of suspicion. To his relief, she smiled, a smile that, for an instant, seemed genuine. "Of course, my love. It's a wonderful idea. He'll adore it." But then she added something that made Richard's blood run cold. "Just let me pack his medicine bag. We can't forget the times. They're very important." The trap was there, subtle and dangerous. If he refused, he would raise suspicion. If he accepted, he would be taking with him precisely the substances he believed were harming his son. "Don't worry," he said, forcing a light tone. "I'll grab it myself. I already know his routine by heart." He got up before she could protest and went to the medicine cabinet. With trembling hands, he took the pretty box, the one containing the placebo or muscle relaxant E, and put it in the bag. Hidden in his pocket, however, was the small dark vial Lena had given him, the supposed cure. The drive to the Catskill Mountains felt like the longest hour of Richard's life. He drove the luxury car through the winding mountain roads, watching Leo in the rearview mirror. The boy looked at the landscape through the window, quiet. With each mile that took them further from the mansion, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but it was replaced by a growing anxiety about what Dr. Evans might discover. He arrived at the secluded estate, a wooden and glass retreat nestled among the trees, and found the doctor's car already parked. Dr. Evans was waiting for him on the porch, his wrinkled face etched with concern. "Richard," he said, shaking his friend's hand firmly, "let's go inside." Inside the house, with the smell of wood and fresh air around them, Richard finally felt safe enough to tell everything. He described the scene in the garden, Lena's words, his suspicions about Martha's illness. He handed over the dark vial and the medicine box Veronica had prepared. Dr. Evans listened in silence, his expression growing more serious with each word. As Richard spoke, the doctor began to examine Leo. With gentle, experienced hands, he tested the boy's reflexes, moved his legs, observed his muscles. Leo, accustomed to examinations, cooperated without complaint. After a long and thorough examination, Dr. Evans sat in an armchair, facing Richard. He sighed deeply, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Richard, clinically, Leo's muscle tone is surprisingly good for someone who hasn't walked in 2 years. There isn't the severe atrophy I would expect to see in a spinal cord injury case, as described to me at the time." Richard's heart leaped. "What does that mean?" "It means there's a chance," the doctor said cautiously. "But I need to analyze these substances. I have a friend at a private lab. I can get the results in a few hours, if we pay for a rush job. It will be expensive, but given your wealth—" "Money is no object," Richard interrupted, his voice firm. "Do whatever it takes. I need to know the truth." Dr. Evans nodded. "In the meantime, let's run a test. With your permission, I'll administer a small dose of this liquid from the dark vial and observe his reaction." Richard looked at his son, who was playing with a toy car on the floor. Fear and hope waged a battle in his chest. That vial with the skull and crossbone symbol could be the key to his son's freedom, or an unknown danger. He took a deep breath. He had trusted the wrong person for 2 years. Now, it was time to bet on the right one. "Do it, doctor. Run the test." The living room of the secluded estate hung in an almost sacred silence. Dr. Evans, with the precision of years of practice, measured a minuscule amount of the dark liquid into an oral syringe. Richard's heart pounded erratically, a mix of terror and expectation. He knelt beside Leo, holding his son's small hand. "Champ, the doctor's going to give you new medicine, okay? It might taste a little different." Leo looked from his father to the doctor, his eyes large and trusting. He opened his mouth without hesitation. The moment the liquid touched Leo's tongue seemed to stretch into eternity. Richard held his breath, his eyes fixed on his son's face, searching for any adverse reaction, any sign of pain or discomfort. Nothing. Leo merely made a face at the bitter taste and returned his attention to his toy car. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Richard and Dr. Evans watched in silence, every movement, every breath the boy took. The only sound was the soft hum of the toy car's motor on the wooden floor. It was Leo who broke the silence. "Daddy, my leg feels tingly." Richard leaned forward, his heart in his throat. "Where, son? Show Daddy." The boy pointed to his right calf. "Here, it tickles." Dr. Evans approached, his eyes gleaming with intense clinical interest. He gently touched Leo's leg. "Can you wiggle your toes, Leo? Try to move them just a little bit." The boy furrowed his brow in concentration. His toes, pale and immobile for so long, trembled. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his right big toe curled upwards. It was a small, hesitant movement, but for Richard, it was like watching the sun rise after a 2-year night. The tears he had held back so fiercely finally escaped, warm and silent, rolling down his face. He didn't care. That small movement was more valuable than all his investments, more precious than all the gold in his vaults. It was proof. It was the truth. "My God," whispered Dr. Evans, his voice thick with emotion. "Richard, there is no spinal cord injury. There never was. Or if there was, it was something minimal that healed a long time ago. He is being systematically sedated. Whatever is in the other medicine box is a potent muscle relaxant. This substance from the dark vial, it must be an antidote, or perhaps simply the absence of the poison." The confirmation hit Richard with the force of a punch. The truth was real, and it was more monstrous than he had dared to imagine. Veronica, she had done this. She had stolen 2 years of his son's childhood. She had watched him suffer, day after day, while playing her role as the devoted stepmother. The pain of betrayal was a sharp knife in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, determined fury. He was no longer the victim. He was the father who would seek justice. "What do we do now?" Richard asked, his voice now firm, devoid of tears. "We need irrefutable proof. The lab results will be the first step," the doctor said, already reaching for his phone to contact his friend. But you cannot go back to that house, not with Leo. It's too dangerous." Richard knew he was right. Returning to the mansion was unthinkable, but simply disappearing would alert Veronica. She had resources, connections. She could use her immense capital against him, paint him as an unstable father who had kidnapped his own son. He needed a strategy, a plan that would catch her by surprise. While Dr. Evans made arrangements for the analysis of the samples, Richard called the only person he could implicitly trust, his sister, Helen, an attorney who lived in another city. He explained the situation in quick, urgent terms. Her reaction was one of shock, followed by the same protective fury he felt. "Stay put. Don't do anything until I get there," Helen said. "I'm taking the first flight. In the meantime, I need you to send me everything you have. Photos of the vials, your written account. I'll start building the legal groundwork for what's to come." Richard hung up, feeling a small fraction of the weight on his shoulders lift. He was no longer alone. But as he watched Leo, who could now slightly bend his knee, a new and terrible concern arose. If Veronica discovered he knew, what would she be capable of? She hadn't hesitated to paralyze a child. What would stop her from doing something worse to silence everyone? At that exact moment, his cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Veronica. The text was simple, but the words made Richard's blood run cold. "Is everything okay? Love, the gardener told me he saw Dr. Evans driving up the mountain today. I got worried." Veronica's message exploded on the cell phone screen like a grenade. Every word was carefully calibrated to sound innocent, but Richard felt the poison behind the facade of concern. The gardener. Of course. She had eyes and ears everywhere. She wasn't just monitoring Leo, she was monitoring him too. The secluded estate, which moments before had seemed like a sanctuary, suddenly became a glass trap. She knew they were there, and she knew Dr. Evans was with them. Richard's initial fury gave way to a glacial fear. He had underestimated his opponent. She wasn't just cruel, she was intelligent, meticulous, and always one step ahead. He looked at Dr. Evans, who had just hung up with the lab, and showed him the message. Color drained from the old doctor's face. "She knows, Richard. We have to get out of here now." But where to go? Returning to the mansion was a sentence. Staying there was waiting for her to make the next move. Richard's mind, trained to find patterns and predict market movements, began working in overdrive, processing the variables. Veronica still didn't know how much he knew. The mention of the gardener was a warning shot. She was testing his reaction. "We can't run," Richard said, the decision forming with chilling clarity. Running would be an admission of guilt. She would use that against me, say I had a breakdown, that I kidnapped my own son. She would control the narrative. "So what are we going to do?" the doctor asked, anxiety etching his voice. "We're going back," Richard said. The phrase hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Dr. Evans stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Go back to her house. That's madness." "No," Richard countered, the plan solidifying in his mind. "It's the only move she won't expect. She expects me to panic, to flee. Instead, I'll go back. I'll pretend nothing happened. I'll say I ran into Dr. Evans by chance in town and invited him for coffee to catch up on old times." It was a monumental risk. It would require a level of acting he wasn't sure he possessed. He would have to look into the eyes of the woman who was destroying his family and smile. He would have to hand his son, now with sensation beginning to return to his legs, back into her care. The idea made him physically ill, but it was the only way to buy time for his sister to arrive, time for the lab results to be ready, time to gather the evidence he needed to destroy her. Dr. Evans, seeing the steely determination in Richard's eyes, nodded slowly. "It's dangerous, but I understand the logic. I'll keep my cell phone on all the time. At any sign of trouble, call me, and I'll alert the authorities at my own risk." With the plan laid out, Richard picked up his cell phone and replied to Veronica's message. His thumb trembled over the screen. "What a coincidence! I ran into him in town. It was great to see him. We're heading home now. Leo misses you. Kisses." He put the phone away, feeling dirty. The hardest part was yet to come. He knelt in front of Leo, who could now contract his thigh muscles with effort. "Son, listen carefully. What happened today? Your toes wiggling, your leg tingling. It's our secret, a very, very important secret. You absolutely cannot tell Aunt Veronica. Can you do that for Daddy?" Leo looked at him, the seriousness of the situation reflected in his childish eyes. He nodded solemnly. "It's our secret power, Daddy." "Exactly, champ," Richard said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "It's our secret power." The drive back was a blur of tension. As they entered the mansion gates, Richard saw Veronica waiting on the entrance steps. She was smiling, the picture of a loving, worried wife. But when their eyes met, beneath the smile, Richard saw something more. A cold, calculating glint. A look that confirmed his worst suspicion. She wasn't just testing him. She was declaring war, and he had willingly marched back into the heart of enemy territory, living under the same roof as Veronica transformed into psychological torture. Every meal was a minefield, every conversation a veiled interrogation. Richard moved through the mansion, his home, like a spy in enemy territory. He smiled, kissed her, feigned a normalcy that corroded his soul, while inwardly counting the minutes for the trap he was setting to close. His sister, Helen's, presence was his anchor. She arrived the next day, under the pretext of a surprise family visit. Helen was Richard's opposite. Where he was reserved and analytical, she was impetuous and direct, a brilliant attorney with a keen instinct for her opponent's weaknesses. Veronica greeted her with forced cordiality. The tension between the two women was almost palpable. An invisible electricity crackling in the air. "So good to have you here, Helen," Veronica said during dinner. "Richard has been so stressed with business. Having family around will do him good." "I always worry about my brother," Helen replied, her sharp gaze fixed on Veronica. "And my nephew. I want to make sure they're both getting the best possible care." The subtle threat did not go unnoticed by Veronica, whose smile tightened for a fraction of a second. While the Cold War unfolded in the dining room, a small victory was happening upstairs. Dr. Evans called Richard with the lab results, confirming his worst suspicions. The medicine in the pretty box contained a high dose of baclofen, a potent muscle relaxant that, administered continuously, could indeed simulate the symptoms of flaccid paralysis, especially in a child. The liquid from the dark vial, on the other hand, was a simple solution of vitamins and a mild neuromuscular stimulant, harmless but effective in counteracting the sedative's long-term effects. The proof was there, scientific and irrefutable. The first mid-story twist had exploded, and Richard now held the weapon he needed. "We have what we need to get an emergency court order and get him out of there," Helen said, when Richard showed her the report sent by the doctor. "But she'll fight. With her money, she can hire the best lawyers, claim you fabricated this." It was then that an unexpected player entered the game. That night, while Richard was in his study with Helen, reviewing the report, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Anna, Lena's mother, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for years. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face etched with fear. "Mr. Richard, excuse me. I need to speak with you. Alone." Helen discreetly withdrew. Anna entered and closed the door, wringing her hands in her apron. "Sir, I can't keep this secret anymore," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw it. I saw Mrs. Veronica. A long time ago. She was in the bathroom, swapping out Leo's medicine. She took the medicine from the original box and put another one in, and she drew that skull on the vial of the good medicine." The verbal confirmation was like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me anything?" "Anna," Richard asked, his voice low, without accusation, just deep pain. Tears finally rolled down the woman's face. "She threatened me, sir. She said if I opened my mouth, she would accuse me of theft, say I had put something in your first wife, Mrs. Martha's, food. I have Lena. I couldn't lose my job. I couldn't go to jail. I was so scared." Anna then revealed the final blow. "That's why I asked Lena to give Leo the good medicine. I couldn't stand to see that boy suffering anymore. I knew the little girl wouldn't raise suspicion. It was a risk, sir, forgive me, but it was the only thing I could do." The second mid-story twist hit him. Lena's courageous act wasn't a childlike impulse, but a desperate plan by her mother. A terrified woman who risked everything to do the right thing. Richard now had not only scientific proof, but an eyewitness. The scales of justice were slowly beginning to tip in his favor. He knew, however, that Veronica wouldn't fall without a fight, and when she discovered he knew, her retaliation would be swift and brutal. The calm before the storm lasted less than 24 hours. Richard and Helen spent the night drawing up a legal strategy, planning each step with the precision of a military operation. They needed to act fast. Before Veronica realized the extent of the net closing around her, but once again, they underestimated her. The next morning, all hell broke loose. Richard came down for breakfast and found the house in a state of contained agitation. Veronica was in the living room, consoling a hysterically crying nanny. 2 private security guards, robust men Richard didn't recognize, stood near the door. "What's going on?" he asked, his stomach clenching into a cold knot. Veronica turned to him, her face a mask of anguish and indignation. "Thank God you're here, darling. It's horrible. There's been a robbery." She hugged him. a theatrical gesture for the audience of staff. "My jewelry, the diamond necklace you gave me, the one that was your mother's, it's gone." Richard felt his blood run cold. He knew with absolute certainty that this was a sham. It was retaliation. It was the plan Anna feared. "Did you call the police?" he asked, his voice controlled. "Not yet," Veronica said. "I wanted to speak with you first. But, Richard, I think I know who it was." She paused dramatically, looking at the housekeeper, Anna, who stood near the kitchen, pale as a ghost. "Anna, she's the only one with a key to my closet. And her husband, John, the gardener. He has access to the whole house." It was an accusation so vile, so calculated, that Richard gasped for air. Veronica had found out. Somehow, she knew Anna had spoken. Perhaps a hidden camera, a microphone. He had been naive. The mansion wasn't just enemy territory, it was a panopticon, and he was at its center. "That's absurd, Veronica," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Is it, darling?" she replied, her blue eyes gleaming with cold triumph. "Then how do you explain this?" She motioned to one of the security guards, who opened a small velvet pouch. Inside, glittering against the dark fabric, was the diamond necklace. "We found it in their closet, in the staff quarters." The trap was perfect, the evidence planted. Anna let out a sob, her body trembling. Her husband, John, the gardener, was brought in from the outdoor area, confused and frightened. "I don't know anything, sir, I swear," he said, desperation in his voice. Richard knew it was the truth. But their word against Veronica's, with the proof in hand. They wouldn't stand a chance. "I don't want to call the police, Richard," Veronica said, her voice now soft, full of false compassion. "They're a family. They have a daughter. It's enough that they leave. Today, now, and never come back." The third mid-story twist hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't just getting rid of his witness. She was disarming him, taking away his allies, isolating him. She was sending him a clear message. "I know what you're planning, and I can destroy anyone who tries to help you." Richard looked at Anna's terrified face and at little Lena, who clung to her mother's skirt, her eyes filled with tears. He couldn't let them be destroyed because of him, but if he openly defended them, Veronica would know he was aware of the full truth, and the main target would become Leo. He was cornered, forced to choose between justice for an innocent family and the safety of his own son. With a heart heavy as lead, he made the only choice he could. "Do what has to be done, Veronica," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned, unable to face Anna's betrayed eyes, and went upstairs. He had sacrificed his pawns to protect his king, but in doing so, he felt like the weakest of men. The war had just begun, and he had already suffered his first and bitterest defeat. Anna's family's departure was swift and humiliating. Veronica's security guards escorted them to the gate as if they were criminals, their few belongings in plastic bags. Lena looked back one last time, her large, accusatory eyes meeting Richard's, who watched from his study window. That look wounded him more than any verbal accusation. He had failed her. The mansion became an even colder and quieter place. The absence of Lena's laughter in the garden was a constant reminder of his failure. Veronica, for her part, acted as if nothing had happened. She resumed her routine as a devoted wife, but there was a new layer of vigilance in her eyes. She knew that he knew, and he knew that she knew. The game of appearances became more intense, more dangerous. The security guards she had hired now patrolled the property day and night, an ostentatious presence that served both to protect the family and to keep them prisoners. Helen, furious with Veronica's maneuver, pressed Richard to act. "We have the lab report. We have your testimony. We can go to the police, request a protective order." But Richard hesitated. The dismissal of Anna and her family was a warning shot. Veronica was capable of anything. "What if she does something to Leo?" he asked, his voice low, paralyzing fear dominating him. She has him under the same roof. If she feels cornered, what stops her from increasing the dose, from causing real and permanent harm? The first significant obstacle stood before them, insurmountable. They were at an impasse. They had the truth, but they couldn't use it without putting the child in even greater danger. And then Veronica made her next move, one that caught them completely by surprise. She scheduled an appointment with Dr. Morgan, the same neurologist who had given Leo's initial diagnosis. Without Richard's knowledge, she contacted him, and days later, a process server appeared at the mansion door with a temporary injunction. The temporary court order alleged that Richard Fontes was experiencing a severe psychological breakdown due to business stress and the ongoing trauma of his son's condition. It claimed he was mentally unstable, exhibiting paranoid behavior and opposing essential medical treatments for Leo. The injunction prohibited him from making any medical decisions about his son until a complete psychiatric evaluation was performed. It was a masterstroke. Using his fortune against him, she painted him as a man on the verge of collapse, and herself, the selfless wife, fighting to protect her stepson. Helen was livid. "This is unbelievable. She's using your paternal devotion against you. We'll appeal. This won't hold up." But the immediate damage was already done. The second obstacle rose, even higher than the first. With the injunction in hand, Veronica took Leo for a consultation with Dr. Morgan and another specialist, both clearly on her payroll. They performed a superficial examination and issued a report confirming the original diagnosis of residual spinal cord injury, refusing to conduct new imaging or toxicology tests, claiming it would be traumatic and unnecessary for the child. Richard was legally powerless. He was a billionaire in a gilded cage, watching his wife consolidate control over his son's life. The house became his prison, and Leo his cellmate. The only glimmer of hope was that, secretly, in the few hours he spent alone with his son, Richard continued to administer the good medicine. Leo's improvements were slow but undeniable. He could already stand, leaning on furniture for a few seconds. Every small progress was a silent victory, a living proof of Veronica's lie, but it was proof he couldn't show anyone. On a particularly grim night, as he tucked Leo into bed, the boy whispered something that made Richard's heart stop. "Daddy, I remembered something from the day I fell. Aunt Veronica was there. She gave me juice with a weird taste that made my tummy hurt really bad." The paralysis had not been caused by a fall. The fall had been the result of what she had given him. And then, the fourth and most terrible mid-story twist manifested, a truth so heinous it left him breathless. Veronica wasn't just paralyzing his son. She had been trying to poison him from the start. Leo's revelation was like a key turning in a long, rusted lock in Richard's mind. Suddenly, fragments of memories, previously disconnected and unimportant, began to click into place, forming a terrifying image. He remembered his first wife, Martha's illness, the weakness, the stomach pains, the perplexed doctors. He remembered Veronica, the nurse, always by Martha's side, administering calming teas and nutritious juices. At the time, he had seen it as exemplary care. Now he saw a method, a slow, patient, and deadly pattern. The idea was so monstrous, so inconceivable, that a part of him refused to accept it, but the seed of suspicion, once planted, began to germinate with terrifying speed. He had no proof, only a growing sense of horror. As Veronica slept beside him, oblivious to the revolution happening in his mind, Richard got up and went to his study. He needed to know. With trembling hands, he typed the name of one of the country's best private investigators, a man known for his discretion and efficiency, whose contact he kept for corporate crises. He sent an encrypted message, setting up a meeting for the next day in a busy downtown coffee shop. Richard, disguised with a baseball cap and dark sunglasses, handed the investigator an ordinary-looking man named Silas. An envelope with a large sum of money and a single instruction: investigate Veronica Schmidt's life before she met me, and investigate the circumstances of my first wife, Martha Fontes' death. I want everything: medical records, financial records, anything. As Silas began his work in the shadows, life in the mansion continued its tense course. Richard lived in a state of constant alert, monitoring every glass, every plate served to Leo. He swapped his son's food for his whenever he could, with flimsy excuses, fearing Veronica would try something again. Leo's progress was his most closely guarded secret. The boy could already take a few shaky steps, leaning on furniture for a few seconds. These were precious, stolen moments that happened behind closed doors in the bedroom or the study. And with the strengthening of his body, Leo's mind also seemed to clear. Memories of the accident came in flashes. "But the juice made me dizzy, Daddy," he said one night. "I tried to run to the bathroom, but my legs felt weak. That's when I fell down the stairs." The subplot, Leo's memory recovery, was becoming the central piece of his silent investigation. Every new memory was a puzzle piece, another nail in the coffin Richard was building for Veronica. A week later, Silas contacted him. The preliminary results were devastating. Veronica, before becoming a nurse, had a brief marriage to an elderly, wealthy businessman who died suddenly of natural causes, leaving her a considerable inheritance, which she quickly spent. Even more shocking was what Silas discovered about Martha's death. He managed, through a contact, to get a copy of the hospital's detailed toxicology report, one Richard had never seen. The report indicated the presence of small but consistent quantities of foxglove, a cardiotoxic plant, in her system. Not enough to be an obvious lethal dose, but enough to, over months, weaken the heart and simulate a degenerative disease. The first major plot twist hit him with the force of a hurricane, tearing away the last vestiges of his denial. Martha had not died from a random life event. She had been murdered, systematically poisoned by the woman now sleeping in his bed. Pain and guilt consumed him. He had brought his wife's killer into his home, handed her his son, his heart, his trust. The fury he felt was so intense it left him trembling. It was no longer just about saving Leo, it was about getting justice for Martha. But, just as Richard's determination reached its peak, Veronica, sensing she was losing control, delivered her cruelest and most desperate blow. That afternoon, Helen called Richard, her voice choked with panic. "Richard, it's Lena, the gardener's daughter. She's disappeared. Her mother is desperate. The last time she was seen, a blonde woman in a luxury car stopped to talk to her near the school." Richard's world collapsed. Veronica was no longer playing defense. She had kidnapped an innocent child, and the message was clear. If he continued, the next victim wouldn't be him. It would be a 6-year-old girl. Lena's kidnapping was a declaration of all-out war. Veronica was no longer hiding behind legal manipulations or subtle lies. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. Richard's initial panic quickly morphed into a glacial, calculating fury. He looked at his son's face, who could now walk with difficulty around the room, and understood the impossible choice Veronica had presented him. The safety of the girl who had saved him versus the safety of his own son. The third obstacle was the most formidable of all. He couldn't go to the local police. Anna's dismissal and the easily obtained injunction had already proven that Veronica had influence, that her money and connections extended beyond the mansion walls. He didn't know who was on her payroll, which investigators or officials might leak his intentions, putting Lena in even greater danger. He was completely alone, surrounded by visible and invisible enemies. That night, the tension in the house was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Veronica acted with a chilling calm, as if nothing was wrong. During dinner, she spoke about a new charity project, about the valuation of an investment fund she was considering acquiring. The normalcy of her conversation was the purest form of torture. Richard could barely swallow his food, Lena's face haunting his thoughts. After dinner, Veronica met him in his study. She closed the door, and the mask of the loving wife dropped. Her eyes were cold as shards of ice. "I hope you got the message, Richard," she said, her voice low and emotionless. "I know everything. About the doctor, your lawyer's sister, the gossiping housekeeper. You've been a fool. This obsession of yours will cost that brat her life." "Where is she, Veronica?" he asked, his voice raw. "She's safe. For now," she replied, circling his desk like a predator. "She'll remain safe. As long as you give up everything, burn your doctor's report, send your sister home, accept the court's decision, we can continue as before, you, me, and Leo." And then she delivered the final blow, the fourth and most terrifying obstacle. "And if you think for 1 second about defying me, remember that I spend every night in this house. I put Leo to bed. A small oversight, a medicine swapped in the dark. Accidents happen. The direct threat against his son's life paralyzed him. He was completely cornered. Any move he made to save Lena could result in Leo's death." He looked at her face, at the woman he had once thought he loved, and saw nothing but emptiness. At that moment, he realized he wasn't dealing with a person guided by emotions, but with a calculating monster. As despair threatened to swallow him, Leo's memory of the accident flashed back into his mind. The juice, the dizziness, the fall, and the third and most devastating major plot twist revealed itself in all its heinous clarity. The paralysis had never been the original plan. The accident hadn't been an accident. It had been an attempted murder that failed. The poison in the juice should have been fatal, but by luck or a dosage error, it only weakened him, causing the fall. The false paralysis was a plan B, a brilliant improvisation by a criminal mind to cover up her initial failure and maintain control. She wasn't just trying to paralyze him to control the inheritance, she was trying to eliminate him. The realization hit Richard with the force of a lightning bolt. There was no negotiation possible with a monster like this. There was no retreat. The only way out was her total destruction. In that instant, the fear in his chest solidified into steely determination. He was no longer the victim. He was no longer the cornered father. He was the hunter. He looked at Veronica, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. A cold smile, devoid of any warmth. "You're right, darling," he said, his voice calm, chillingly calm. "I was a fool. It's over. You win." He needed her to believe him. He needed her to lower her guard, to think she had broken his spirit. Because to catch a monster, you need to set the perfect trap. And the bait, the most irresistible bait of all, would have to be the one thing they both pretended to love: his son, Leo. The emotional climax was approaching, and he would have to risk everything, including his son's life, in a last, desperate move to expose the whole truth. Richard's surrender was a masterpiece of acting. He became the embodiment of defeat. He pushed his sister away, claiming she was causing unnecessary trouble. He tore up a printed copy of the medical report in front of Veronica. He spent his days in his study, appearing apathetic and broken. Veronica, triumphant, relaxed her guard. She believed she had won, had completely crushed his will. It was exactly what Richard needed. Secretly, the gears of his plan were turning at top speed. He used his vast financial resources and the help of the investigator Silas to set up a complex operation. He hired a team of security specialists, former federal agents, who operated in the shadows. They installed miniature microphones and cameras throughout the mansion, turning the house into a stage where the final act would be recorded. The biggest part of the plan, however, was Leo. Richard carefully prepared him. explaining that they needed to play a theater game to save Lena. The boy, with a maturity beyond his years, understood the gravity of the situation. He was the bait. The climax was set for an evening when Veronica would be celebrating her victory. She had organized a small dinner at home to celebrate Richard's recovery. The plan was simple and terribly risky. During dinner, Leo, who had been feigning a regression in his condition, would accidentally stand up from his wheelchair and take a few steps towards his father before falling. Veronica's reaction to this public and undeniable demonstration of recovery would be the key. That night, the dining table was set with the finest china. Veronica was radiant. Richard played his role as the submissive husband to perfection. In the middle of dinner, as planned, Leo reached out to Richard. "Daddy, help me." He struggled to stand from his chair. For a second, he balanced, took 2 faltering steps toward Richard, and then, as rehearsed, gently fell onto the rug. The silence in the room was absolute. Veronica froze, her fork midway to her mouth, her face a mask of shock and barely contained fury. Leo's recovery was the only thing that could ruin her control, that could invalidate the court order and expose her lies. Later that night, the real performance began. Richard led Veronica to the library. One of the rooms he knew was fully bugged. He confronted her, not with anger, but with false resignation. "I saw Veronica. He's walking. How is this possible?" Veronica, still shaken, tried to maintain her composure. "It's a miracle, darling. Our efforts—" "Don't lie to me." Richard's voice rose, filled with fabricated pain. This changes everything, doesn't it? The report, the court order, everything was based on his paralysis. It was then that she took the bait. Believing he was cornered and confused, she decided to confess, to reassert her power over him. "Don't be naive, Richard. The paralysis was never permanent. It was a tool, a way to keep things under control after my initial plan with the juice failed, just as your dear Martha was a tool for me to get to you and your fortune. And the girl is my insurance policy to ensure you stay in line." Every word was a confession, captured in high-definition audio and video. "What do we do now that he's walking?" Richard asked, leading her to checkmate. She smiled, a cruel smile. "Don't worry. A small relapse is easy to arrange. No one will question it. And as for the girl, as soon as I'm sure you'll behave, she'll have a little accident, a tragic but necessary end." At that exact moment, the library doors opened. They were not Veronica's security guards. They were state troopers, led by a lead detective Helen had contacted, men who were not on the local payroll. Beside them stood Silas, the investigator, holding a tablet that live-streamed the confession. Veronica's face crumbled, the color draining, arrogance replaced by pure panic. The gradual resolution began there. The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings, the medical report, Anna's testimony and, crucially, Lena's location, which Veronica, in her arrogance, revealed during the confession. Silas's team acted immediately, rescuing the girl, safe and sound. Richard's first victory was seeing his son, Leo, running towards him in the foyer, free from the wheelchair forever. But it was a bittersweet victory, tainted by the knowledge of the stolen years. The second victory came days later, when the police, with the new evidence, exhumed Martha's body and confirmed the long-term poisoning. Justice for his first wife was on its way. The arrest of Veronica and her accomplices, including the bought doctors, was headline news across the country. The empire she tried to build on lies and pain crumbled in a single night. 4 weeks had passed since the night the truth exploded in the library. The mansion, once a stage of tension and fear, slowly returned to being a home. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the most precious sound in the world for Richard, the sound of Leo's feet running across the grass. The garden, the stage for the beginning of that nightmare, became the setting for healing. On that golden afternoon, the same light that once seemed unable to penetrate Richard's soul now warmed it completely. He watched Leo and Lena running, their laughter echoing among the rose bushes. They didn't run like children who had just met, but with the familiarity of two soldiers who had fought and won a war together. Richard's ultimate victory wasn't Veronica's arrest or the recovery of his fortune, which she had tried to divert. His victory was there, in flesh and blood, running under the sun. He had done more than just settle scores. After Lena's rescue, he brought Anna and her family back, not as employees, but as part of his new, rebuilt family. He gave them the staff quarters, not as lodging, but as a gift, and created a trust fund to ensure Lena's education through university. Anna, with her quiet strength and unwavering decency, had become a maternal figure for Leo and a friend and confidant for Richard. She was the guardian of the normalcy and affection the house so desperately needed. Justice for Martha was the final piece of the emotional puzzle. Veronica's trial was swift. The evidence was irrefutable. Convicted, she would disappear from their lives forever. Richard felt a profound relief, not one of revenge, but of closure. He could finally mourn the loss of his first wife purely, free from the shadow of betrayal that had tainted it. The journey had transformed him. The multimillionaire businessman who blindly trusted the superficial glitter of appearances had learned to see the true value in things. He discovered that the greatest wealth was not in his assets or his net worth, but in loyalty, courage, and selfless love. He saw that true strength did not lie in the power money could buy, but in the vulnerability of admitting he needed help and the courage to trust again. Leo, the boy who had spent 2 years believing in his own fragility, learned a profound lesson. He discovered that the worst prisons are those we cannot see, built with lies and fear, and he learned that a father's love and a friend's courage could break even the strongest chains. His physical recovery was remarkable, but his emotional resilience was the true miracle. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Leo ran to Richard, his face flushed with happiness. "Daddy, let's race to the oak tree." Richard smiled, a genuine smile that came from the depths of his soul. He crouched down, getting to his son's level. "You'll win, champ! You always win!" He stood up and began to run beside Leo, their steps synchronized on the soft grass. They ran together, father and son, toward the tree where, 4 weeks earlier, a small vial with a skull and crossbone symbol had unleashed the end of a nightmare and the beginning of a new life. The businessman who accumulated a great fortune discovered that the best investment he had ever made was not in the stock market, but in the trust he placed in a brave little girl. True love, he realized, sometimes comes disguised as danger, administered in small, secret doses by the purest and most improbable hands.